Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Today, we discuss integrating the Catholic Church's teachings on sexuality with the day-to-day practice of therapy. Our welcome guest is Michael Gasparro. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of California, my state. At any rate, he's previously worked for 4 years at the Breakthrough Clinic under the supervision of Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. Now he operates his own practice, providing professional therapy services. Now, Michael knows Catholic radio and Catholic video casts. He's been a guest on Relevant Radio. Once at a conference, I went to the Relevant Radio booth and I said, "Hi, I'm from Irrelevant Radio." And the fellow says to me, "I think you need counseling. You need a better self-image." But he's also been on the Eternal Word television network and Sirius is XM's the Catholic channel. He's also worked for several years as a religious educator in the role of confirmation coordinator and gentle auditors and viewers. You probably remember not so long ago, we had Ed Rushman, a stalwart of the American Solidarity Party, our party, who's also a confirmation coordinator way down in Orange County. At any rate, we're going to begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of the faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. If I may, you were once mostly a musician and a musician educator, and now you're mostly a therapist. That's quite a transition. How did that work out?
First, I realized that there was more I wanted to do than music, and that was the first step. Is after doing a lot of music teaching, music performing, music ministry for several years after school, after finishing undergraduate degree in music at Baylor University in Texas, excuse me, then I realized, you know what, I think there's more I want to do. And it actually started when I began volunteering with confirmation ministry at a church in Los Angeles called St. Monica's. And through doing ministry volunteer work, I began to see there was a need for additional professional support for the team. So I began to work for them. And that really piqued my interest in healing ministry and in the idea of accompanying people through difficulties they were going through. And so I decided to explore the possibility of becoming a therapist. And that's what led me down initially pursuing that path.
So it was a transition, but it was a pretty natural transition at the same time.
I think it was. And also as a musician and as a singer, I once heard somebody say that being a singer, you help, or being an artist of any kind, you're helping people feel their emotions. You're helping them address their concerns through projecting an image out that they can look at and see themselves inside of that image, or see themselves in your work and what you're presenting. And so I was really interested in helping people feel and heal their emotions. And then transitioning into becoming a therapist, I feel like I'm in a different role and utilizing a different set of skills, but a similar mission, helping people feel and heal their emotional lives.
I'm just going to mention something in passing. It's hard for me to stay totally on message. You mentioned St. Monica's.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I understand it, St. Monica's is really the mother church of Southern California. And it was badly vandalized last week. Perhaps you heard about this. There were a number of things stolen. Sound equipment, a lot of expensive sound equipment. And there was a very deliberate attempt to break into the tabernacle. Pictures were shown of the tabernacle pried out with, I don't know, maybe a crowbar. But as Monsignor Torkelson said afterwards, we say the Our Father every day, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others. So we have to forgive. And this is all within the last week, and it's one of many, many attacks on the part of vandals on Catholic churches around the country. So where you started your work has been very much in the news lately here in Los Angeles. Mario, you're not in Los Angeles, you're in Kansas. And what would you like to address next?
Well, it's not that it's only happening unfortunately, in Los Angeles. It's happening everywhere. Last week was in Chile, small town. A church was vandalized and the halls were taken and thrown away. And yesterday that happened in Paraguay in the Supreme Court. The statue of Our Lady was vandalized too. So it seems that the rage of the devil is everywhere, unfortunately. Having said that, I have a question. When you, Michael, said that you moved from being a musician to a counselor, so you had to enroll again in a university in order to pursue your degree. That was you did it. In other words, you changed your life almost completely in that sense. Am I right in my assessment?
Yes. In order to be a professional counselor, call yourself a professional therapist in the state of California and in most states in the United States, or every state, I should say, you have to have an accredited graduate degree of some kind, either master's or PhD or PsyD level, and then you have to go through licensing qualifications after your studies. So I went to Hope International University, and that's in Orange County, actually. And then I did a master's degree in marriage and family therapy at that university. And then I pursued my licensure through seeking what we would call associateship hours at various clinics and clinical sites that I could gain experience and begin to prepare for my license.
That's good. Listen, what is Breakthrough Clinic?
The Breakthrough Clinic is the private practice where I worked for the last 4 years, actually. I just recently transitioned from working for the Breakthrough Clinic to having my own private practice. And the practice is led by a therapist named, he's a psychologist named Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. And he is especially known for helping men and women deal with unwanted sexuality issues. So sexual fetishes, same-sex erotic arousal, and other kinds of compulsive sexual behaviors like pornography, compulsion and addiction, and things of that nature. So I gained a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom and knowledge in the field of helping people address unwanted sexual issues in a therapeutic environment using standard evidence-based talk therapy techniques.
You mentioned obsessive compulsive behavior. And I think you're doing research on the link between what now is a recognized acronym, OCD, and sexual, I don't know, something broad enough to say, sexual disorders. How would that link work out?
That's $1 million question. So by research, I should clarify, I'm not doing original research in the field by conducting experiments, but I'm doing a lot of research into looking at existing literature and trying to explore theories that explain phenomena that are being discovered through existing research. So, for example, a lot of research into mental health conditions among what would be called either MSM populations, that's men who have sex with men. And I apologize if I'm using a harsh vocabulary, but you have to understand in the social sciences, they don't necessarily use identifier language like gay when they're doing research, because that might discredit aspects of their research. If somebody, the population they're studying might not call themselves gay, but if they're having sexual encounters with someone of the same gender, they want to broadly categorize it. So, for instance, among men who have sex with men populations, in known secular, non-religious oriented research, OCD exists at a statistically significant higher level. And in other recent research, especially among young people with OCD and same-sex erotic arousal, so they called it in this research study, LGBT populations. And that research I've reviewed recently, those with same-sex issues and OCD have statistically significant more OCD about religion, sexuality, and violence as a category. So there are a lot of interesting, unique phenomena popping up in literature that I'm seeing about high levels of OCD among, let's say, gay men, if you will, or men who have sex with men, and high levels of those individuals having obsessions with sexuality and religion and violence. So a lot of these coexisting conditions trigger interest in me because my clinical population, generally speaking, almost 2/3 to 3/4 of my caseload, that means clients I'm working with who have same-sex issues or higher, have diagnosable levels of OCD. So these are very interesting phenomena that I'm personally fascinated by, and I want to understand better, both as a clinician, as a human being, to try to understand why do we do the things we do, and what type of pathology may exist that contributes to reducing our freedom to act freely for the good in regard to our lives. Because a lot of my clients are Catholics or people of other sincere faith traditions that don't want to be doing the things they keep finding themselves doing over and over again.
That's an extraordinarily interesting link.
And keep in mind that I'm not saying there's a definite conclusion I've come to in this regard, but I think there's enough interesting information being discovered through research that if we had a more honest body of researchers throughout most universities in the United States, people would be researching this type of correlation with more curiosity and more fervor. But anything in the realm of researching pathology associated with LGBT orientations is fraught with a lot of political difficulties. So I think it's limiting the kind of research that would be really helpful to see more current research around. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I taught philosophy for many years. Mario's still doing it. And oftentimes when students would come in and ask to discuss a certain question, and I give them my answer, they'd say, well, that makes sense. So I didn't say that it was true. It made sense. Now, I admire, and we're going to get to Mario, who will be more rigorous, I'm sure, but you know me, an anecdote a day. I admire the tentativeness with which you propose this link between compulsive behavior in general and same-sex attraction disorders. I admire your tentativeness. I think the general population, of course, we know that no one is average, but nonetheless, there's a general population, excuse me, are leery of new studies in education and new studies in psychology.
They should
there was
be.
a new study the other day, and the conclusion was it's sometimes okay to struggle with difficult subject matter in classrooms.
Okay.
And I thought, this is new. And evidently the idea has been that there's been a drift or an avalanche towards everything's right if you kind of think it's all right, and objectivity can be a noose around your neck and so forth and so on. Now, you on the other hand are looking at this in a very tentative way, and I think it's good, and it seems right. I mean, in the history of therapy in the West, we had absolute ascendancy of Freudian psychoanalysis, and now a general agreement that it's pretty much worthless. I mean, it was absolutely central, and certainly in the lives of any number of intellectuals, all kinds of references to it. You had Darwin, and that was the truth. And you had Freud, and that was the truth. And you had Marx, and that was the truth. Well, I'm sure there's elements of truth in Marx and in Freud and in Darwin, but people have kind of been battered by studies. So I'm glad that you're approaching this in a tentative way. It certainly is a plausible line of analysis.
Well, and I'm not totally formulating this from scratch either. I mean, I remember first reading in a graduate textbook of some kind that it said the similarities between what specifically were fetish disorders, and this is a study of fetish disorders, not specifically same-sex erotic issues. And they said that this is just a textbook. It said that basically the presentation of symptoms of fetish disorders was so similar to OCD that many theorists were considering them on a similar spectrum of disorder. So they wouldn't say that about homosexuality, because that's another bridge to cross when you call homosexuality a disorder. But certainly before the 1970s, the established psychological community considered them in a similar category in the paraphilic disorders. So I am tentative, but I'm not totally formulating these out of left field, as it were. These ideas are really from a sincere tradition of, while I agree with you, the psychoanalysts and the tradition of psychoanalysis is far less dominant in the field, there certainly are threads of their ideas that permeate the field that I'm in now. Some of them are good and some of them are terrible, it seems to me. So I just want to clarify too that this isn't a totally unique idea that I'm formulating on my end.
Okay, Mario, your thoughts?
Well, I think you, in some way, you answered, but my question always has been that when you say, well, I'm feeling X, and then I can make a claim that I'm feeling that way because my image of my own being is based on a particular anthropology, if you will. In other words, nobody is really neutral. Now, having said that, if your client comes to see you and ask for that particular feeling, what would be your approach? What is your starting point? Because I assume, even though you have somehow gathered all this tradition and make let's say, your own view, what would be your approach, your view? You are not a disciple of Freud, or you may not, but then you should have, I guess, an approach based upon your own tradition. And which one is it?
Mario, I think the first step to that is to say that everybody, as you're mentioning, has a view. And I think the biggest concern I have with the modern psychological establishment is the claim of some kind of neutrality, that they exist in this morally neutral, science-minded field while concurrently making broad, sweeping moral claims. So it's a real bait and switch that they pull in that regard. I try to, as my predecessor and former short-term mentor, Dr. Nicolosi Sr. said, and expose my bias so that I don't impose my bias. And I don't even like to call it a bias, but my view of human anthropology is rooted in my Catholic faith. So I'm a Catholic first, before I'm a follower of Christ by God's grace, before I am anything else on this earth, before I am a therapist, before I am a brother, whatever I am. It starts with that understanding of the human person. As imperfectly as I follow Christ and as dependent as I am on my need for the grace of our Lord, that is my anchor point for how I view the human person. And that's really important to therapy because it does color not only my practice of therapy, but how I view my clients. So not just my techniques, but how I see them as individuals, whether or not they are also Catholic. I work with a lot of Muslim men, and I still hold the same anthropological view in terms of their dignity made in the image and likeness of God, which plays an important factor in how we discuss issues that our culture right now says are more important than that identity as a child of God. And one of my friends, Dr. Christopher Kaiser at Loyola Marymount University, who's a fantastic author and speaker on a lot of issues related to happiness, the psychology of happiness in particular, he said to me once in a conversation that human beings flourish when their identity is based on the most solid thing possible. I'm summarizing. He spoke more eloquently, but essentially he said in our culture, one or two temporal factors right now seem really important to identity that are very transient. So skin color, for instance, or sexual feelings and impulses. And he said, those are basically very poor measures or very poor things to base your entire identity upon because they're so fluid and they're not eternal. And the only thing that's eternal, as we know, is God. And so when our identity is based in something eternal, when we see the human person's identity based in something eternal, it gives us a much better foundation for human flourishing. And that's what we're seeking to do in therapy, is help people flourish and be as happy and healthy as they can possibly be in this life.
Can I follow up that one?
Sure.
Many years ago, I was very interested in psychology. And I remember reading or debating about the issue of spiritual direction. And there was a little book written in the 80s by a psychiatrist, Spanish psychiatrist, which was Psychoanalysis and Spiritual Direction. So if I remember him well, Torello was his name, there was many connection between these two type of counseling. I need to explain much better that, but let's call it counseling. When you talk about happiness, it seems to me that this fulfillment can only be reached in a Christian experience. So I assume. So how this type of counseling, when you go to a counselor and you go to a spiritual director, how do they differ and how do they are similar?
Some of this question I can't answer because I'm not a priest, for instance, and I'm not a trained spiritual director. So I'm not really in the position to clarify all their distinctions. I have sat on a panel with a priest before discussing some of those distinctions and heard some of his arguments. I think one thing is that traditionally we think of therapy as a place where it's professionally guided self-change, where I'm guiding somebody, but they're changing their own life. They're making the changes they see fit. I see my role as helping people remove psychological barriers to prepare them for spiritual well-being. Sometimes that involves spiritual discussions, but I'm not actively coaching people on their spiritual lives. I will say that there are times where the lines blur, And I also think there are times where I have to know my limits, or try to, and refer people out and tell them, I think you need a spiritual director for these matters. This discussion, this counseling is not the totality of what you need. It will never replace spiritual direction therapy. But I do think that there is a place for them to complement one another at times, given the focus of my education and background versus the focus of perhaps spiritual directors. Not just education and background, they could have both, but the focus of their work with the client, perhaps.
You.
Let me back up a little bit. This is more of a, as they say at philosophy conferences, an intervention than a question. And that term is used by people who come from my philosophical tradition that are always put off by people who stand up and instead of asking a question, deliver a 5-minute lecture. So we refer to it as an intervention rather than a question.
Go for it.
That's not the usual response. The usual response is casting an earnest glance upwards. You mentioned that so often there's a claim to neutrality, and in psychological research and in counseling, a claim to neutrality. But in fact, you scratch the surface and it's not neutral at all. But nonetheless, that's always the claim. And I think from a philosophical perspective, you can trace that back and forth. Are we neutral or are we not neutral? Well, we have to say at least that we're neutral because, after all, we're scientists. You can trace that back to what's sometimes called fact-value distinction. There's a difference between saying, I stole 5 beans. I don't know why anybody would limit themselves. I stole 5 beans and it was bad that I stole 5 beans. There's a difference between the two. It's a fact that I stole them, whereas it's bad that I stole them would be a value. And that's linked with what's oftentimes called the is-ought fallacy. And you can find a very clear expression of that in one of the central thinkers of empiricism, David Hume, who said in effect, although he was a master stylist of English prose, he said in effect, I'm always reading passages that involve is claims that are descriptive. I see so many passages that are descriptive. And then all of a sudden I see these conclusions that are normative. And I wonder how you get the normative conclusion out of the descriptive premises. And he says, you can't. If you're going to talk normative talk, you just start talking normative talk. And somebody says, where does that come from? Hume says, well, basically it's an expression of the speaker's feelings. And of course, once we turn to feelings, we really get the ear, I think, of a great many people and a great many therapists. At any rate, from a Christian perspective, what we want to say is, it's not as if facts about the world, facts about the universe, facts about the human person are somehow value-free. They're value-impregnated. Take the very notion of creation. It's God's creation. God didn't say after he created the world and all the things in it, I'm neutral. I'm neutral about all of this stuff. He said it's good. It's good. So, and I think this connects with what Mario was saying. If you push this debate, fact, value, normative, descriptive. If you push it back far enough, you come to the bedrock Christian, Judaic, Islamic view of creation. The created order is not neutral, it's good. It's good. Well, at any rate, maybe ending the intervention, could you tell us a bit in your experience how it is, if you have experienced this, that Catholic teaching on sexuality is misunderstood or maligned? And if you have seen that, what do you suppose is the trigger for it?
Well, first, I'd like to say that a great example of the fact-value distinction that you're mentioning, which is really pertinent to our conversation, comes from a very simple section of the frequently asked questions portion of the American Psychological Association's website, because I think this will help prepare my answer, which is that you can go there yourself. I encourage your listeners to do your own research. I went to this website 2 days ago with a friend. I always love people to see it with their own eyes. It's so shocking. In their frequently asked questions section on their website, the largest body of psychologists in the world, when asked what causes LGBT orientations, says there is no consensus among scientists, and most believe it is some combination of nature and nurture that influence the development of these orientations. Then they say shortly after, but they are good and normal orientations. So they first drop a truth bomb, if you will, that no one is born this way. In so many, I told my friend, it's as if, I mean, this concession from this liberal organization is no small thing. It'd be like O.J. Simpson's lawyers showing up and be like, he might have done it. We don't know. I mean, it's a huge concession. They're like, they're not born this way. Some complex combination of nature and nurture caused this. And by the way, it's normal and good and healthy. So there is that sort of fact value combination, and unless I'm misunderstanding your proposition of that idea, that is really betraying their proposed or supposed neutrality on these issues. They are now offering a very clear value judgment. And therefore, that comes in direct conflict with your question, is there something that is maligned or misunderstood about Catholic teaching? Yeah. Namely, that the view of the human person as intrinsically ordered towards heterosexual functioning through biological design and spiritual creation, that is viewed as bigoted, essentially, in my field, and harmful towards clients of minority sexual orientations. I use air quotes because I don't know if I think that term really lends itself towards a more sort of critical race theory, intersectional thing that I'm not a huge fan of. So these sexual minority populations are being harmed in theory by the APA if I make a claim that it is disordered for somebody not only to act on homosexual impulses, but that the impulses themselves, the feelings themselves, are intrinsically disordered. So I wish people understood. You said, what I wish they understand. I think that was part of your question. Maybe I'm imagining it because I wanted my own intervention. But what I wish people understood, yeah, what I wish.
I'll tell you right now, Mario, when I do an intervention, my friend Mario says it's a rant.
My parents would say, get off my soapbox. But yeah. My point is, what I wish people understood is that we are losing the battle with young minds, in my opinion, about this topic in terms of proposing the goodness and the excitement and the adventure of our Catholic view of sexuality. So how can we shift that? I think we need to propose the intrinsic truth, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, I'd love to be corrected if I'm wrong, that the sexual teaching, the moral sexual teachings of our church intrinsically lead us to happiness, to the happiness we're longing for in our life. They do not lead us away from authentic happiness. they may challenge us to surrender aspects of temporary pleasure, but self-restraining love ultimately leads us towards the highest order of self-fulfillment possible this side of heaven. Now, do I or anybody in this life do it perfectly? I say very rarely, probably. I mean, we have the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph, but it doesn't mean that it's not aspirational or worth working towards or surrendering to God's grace to conform ourselves in that way as best we can.
Thank you, Mario.
I have a philosophical question, but I'm going to.
I'm intimidated. You guys are philosophy professors.
No, but
philosophy
this is
professor. So,
I just a rant. When you talk about anthropology of the human person, we need to get to know that and what is the Catholic tradition. When I read that, I ask myself, there has been more than one view of the human person, even within the Catholic tradition. So much so that John Paul II criticized, yes, he criticized Aquinas' view in the sense that was highly intellectualist. So the role of emotion, for whatever reason, historical reason and so on, were not developed in such a way that we can understand really how one individual behave or react or is educated. So the role of emotion came quite late in Catholic tradition. You read in 1940s, it's very different than reading 1960s. And so when we talk about Catholic anthropology, if you ask me, I'm just thinking in personalism and certain type of personalism where the role of emotion are key. And myself, I was educated in a view which emotion were had in the Catholic tradition a negative connotation. You must be strengthen your will and all that, and emotion were completely put aside. Now, having said that, that's my rank of today. If that is the case, or the claim, one of the questions I always ask myself, what do you mean, or what do counselors mean by healing? What is healing? In other words, I go to see a counselor and I have issues and so on. When do I know really that I'm being healed and feel better? What is I understand that in physical illnesses somehow, but what is in psychology?
Jim, you want to take this one?
I'm
Just
sorry.
kidding.
I don't think there's any tension between Mario and myself. I just want to mention just in passing that in the Liturgy of the Hours, the wonderful ongoing prayer of the Church, what's really central is the Psalms. And if you want a wholehearted expression of feelings, look no further than the Psalms. They are powerful expressions of human feelings. But Mario didn't ask me. He asked me.
So
What
there.
are your initial thoughts? Well, we could put it this way. I bet that you sometimes come back from a day's work thinking that this person or that person is getting better.
Yeah.
And why? Why do you think
Well,
that?
there are two, I'm kind of teasing by avoiding the question. This is a question for the ages, Mario. It's no small question, which is why I kind of deferred at first. But there are two angles to the question that I'm hearing. One is, how does my Catholic faith integrate with the view of the emotional well, how does my Catholic faith inform my understanding of the emotional life? And then there's this second part, which is, how do I know when people are getting better? How do I markedly distinguish when somebody is improving? Part of the reason this is a difficult question to answer is because improvement depends on someone's presenting symptoms. So I think the most general answer from a psychotherapeutic standpoint would be, when someone's presenting symptoms are diminishing and their goals are noticeably achieved, that is how you know therapy has been a success. But therapists, again, are just guides. We don't have magic wands. So a lot of the changes people make in therapy come through their own shifts that they've created in their life. In terms of ways I noticed that, I'll give a more practical example. So if somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder comes to therapy and we talk about feeling and healing the emotional life, there are a lot of different theories as to why OCD exists. But one theory is a hyperactive fear response. So somebody is excessively fearful, and too many things are perceived as threats to the self that are not actually threats. So in that person, their emotion of fear is excessive and irrational. So healing their emotional life means helping them find ways to both respond to perceived threats differently and guide their emotions more rationally. There is room for Thomistic language here. I especially like the work of a psychiatrist who is from the Netherlands but moved to the United States, named Dr. Conrad Bars. I know he has a lot of fans in the United States and some critics as well. I think he did an incredible job of synthesizing a lot of Thomistic language with even aspects of Freudianism, but he challenged Freud. He really departed, and Father Brian Malati is coming out with a new book soon for EWTN, reviewing a lot of the work of Dr. Bars, and I think your listeners may enjoy it. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I've heard Father Brian Malati's other work, a lot of which I found incredibly useful to answer this question. But what I'm going to highlight is the idea that our emotional life is like a horse and our intellectual life is like the rider. And without the horse, we cannot go as far and cannot achieve as much as a rider if we didn't have the horse. But if we let the horse run free and don't cultivate a relationship of trust with the horse as the rider, if we starve the horse, we could kill the horse, or the horse could run us off a cliff. So this relationship is really one that needs to be cultivated over time, where the intellect helps the emotions mature and guides them with the right reason, strengthening what Dr. Bars would call authentic willpower, where the emotions are faculties given to us by God, all of which are healthy, which help us to choose the good and avoid evil because they provide us energy or movement, emotion, right? It's in the word motion. So I really emphasize in my work with clients that our emotions are gifts from God, but they need to be cultivated and guided with a well-formed conscience and with our higher faculty of our intellect, so that we together utilize those gifts of the emotions towards choosing good and avoiding evil. But I believe it was St. Thomas Aquinas that said it is unique for wrath to act upon evil. In other words, something like you have to be able to hate in order to hate evil and to fight evil. So I think too many Catholics avoid out of excessive fear their emotion of anger or even sadness because they feel like it's weak or it doesn't indicate that they trust God, when really the emotions of anger and sadness are just aspects of the human experience that tell us about what we're going through and help inform which direction we should take next in our step forward, trusting God as we go. That's the best I got for now, but I'm open to follow-up questions. It's a really hard question, Mario. I appreciate you asking it, though.
No, that's good.
Difference between anger and sadness and rage and despondency. If anger goes to rage, reason is no longer functioning, and if sadness goes to despondency, reason is no longer functioning. It is interesting. Michael, you were encouraging people to check out the American Psychological Association website. It is interesting that there's a big chunk of the Summa specifically on fear. Very, very interesting. I'd like to ask you, Michael, I think from comments you've made that you are very keen to point out the role of friends and mentors. You've mentioned some mentors of your own, some intellectual friends. But could you say a bit about friendship, which is certainly a Thomistic theme, because Thomas says that it's in the context of friendship that we do flourish, and that what we're looking for is a world of friends. And even in the political sphere, we're looking for civic friendship. But at any rate, what do you have to say today about friends and mentors?
Specifically regarding issues with sexuality, or just in general for psychological well-being?
Both. General and particular, particular and general. No general without a lot of particulars. If we only have particulars, we're in a fog.
Well, for me personally, friendship has been such an important part of my emotional healing journey, to use the words I used before, to help me feel less excessive fear in my life, so that my passions or my emotions could be more balanced, and I can experience the joy of life through relationship, through engaging in authentic relationship with brothers and family members. And I had to look at a lot of, and I still am looking at a lot of the negative beliefs about myself at times that make it hard for me to accept the gift of my lovable self, as Dr. Bars puts it. And he says, Dr. Bars says that friendship, or parents, starting with our parents, but moving into friendship, is essential for the human person to internalize emotionally, not just cognitively, but internalize at an emotional level the goodness of themselves, which helps us to see that we are loved and that we can then give of ourselves to others. And so I really like the idea that it's not incumbent upon me to learn that I am lovable on my own. It starts with God loving me, but really at an emotional level, I internalize that through other people, through friends and mentors. And I am somebody who also experiences a history of having same-sex sexual issues. So in particular, same-sex friendships have been an essential part of trying to understand the idea that I am a part of the world of men. I am an equal to other men. I am not less than or different than in some categorical way. I may have distinctive struggles or issues that are not the same as every other man. Perhaps a small percentage of men have these particular issues, but that doesn't make me categorically different. I am a man, just like you're a man, Jim, just like you're a man, Mario. And friendship has been a really essential part of learning that in a way that has been tremendously powerful in my ability to look outside of myself and to be able to think of my life as part of God's story and not my own egotistical drama. As I love Bishop Robert Barron as an intellectual hero of mine, and I really found profound healing as well through his challenge for me to see my life, for all of us to see our lives as part of the theodrama and not the ego drama. And I think friendship has helped me to do that. And it's really important for a lot of people with same-sex sexual issues that friendship, especially if they're living chastely or celibately, is the primary form of intimacy they have in their lives. So it's really essential.
That's from Balthasar.
Yeah, from
Balthasar.
Love Alone is Credible. I just read recently, and my head is still spinning off its axis because
right. It just And precisely, one of the interesting things is, I think Jim knows this more than I do, is the conversion of Jacques Maritain in 1908, when people say, well, his conversion came through philosophical reasoning. That is not what he said, or at least his wife said. It's an encounter with the mystery, and the mystery has a face, and that face was Léon Blois. And they explain how that came about. And through the friendship with that poet, which nobody really liked, changed their life. And then they changed intellectually. And that's very, very unique. And very often we Catholics don't realize that change comes through encounters. So I have a final question. How do you see, or do you receive the impact in your practice of the effect of the pandemic in terms of mental illnesses? Have you seen more problems with people because of the pandemic?
I can't draw definitive conclusions, but I think the people that I work with, from what I've observed, who had struggled with social isolation and depression issues in particular, they were really struggling with the amount of increased social isolation that was built into the society that we lived in over the last couple of years. So I think that's been really difficult. I've also seen, especially among children, I was working at a high school, a Catholic school, providing counseling to high school students during that time. And I saw the profound impact on young people who were really isolated. And it wasn't like they were living on a homestead farming with their family. A lot of them were just at home by themselves all day in their bedroom. So yeah, I saw that really impacting young people, especially in a negative way. Unfortunately, hopefully we've moved past, by now, I hope there's been a lot of shift in that regard.
Thank you.
I have one last question as well. You have a good number of Muslim clients. How did this come about?
That's a great question, and I wish I had an answer. No, I worked for the Breakthrough Clinic, as I mentioned, and Dr. Nicolosi Jr. is well known internationally especially because of his father's writings, which it's not that he's the only person talking about same-sex issues in therapy. It's just that most people that talk about it don't write about it because it made him extremely infamous. The New York Times did a hit piece the day he died, dancing on his grave, to give an example, in 2017. So it's a really caustic environment for anybody who's going to say or speak out about the possibility that somebody with same-sex erotic arousal, not only that they weren't born that way, that factors in their environment influence it, but that they also, through traditional methods of talk therapy, might find some relief, reduction in behaviors, perhaps even reduction in their same-sex erotic feelings. And God forbid you even say that there's a potential they could live happily as a heterosexual married person. And the evidence is there. You can find people, if you look, even online, through testimonies, through a variety of websites, of people who have walked this path. But Dr. Nicolosi Sr. dared to say it out loud. And in fact, he came out of Los Angeles, Jim, where he was maligned at times by the church for his stance, because there was a lot of controversy at the time in the Diocese of Los Angeles amongst aspects of the clergy and the way that things were handled in that regard. So I think I say this with great care for him as a mentor of mine, he took a lot of hits for being as public about same-sex sexual issues in therapy and how they could be addressed and people could find healing and change was possible for some people. And for that reason, people in the Islamic community, people in the Muslim world were hungry for some kind of hope for men who struggle with this issue, because they, believe it or not, do not acquiesce to the Western view that same-sex marriage is just as good and is the same as heterosexual marriage. So a lot of these people are on YouTube, they're looking for resources, and not a lot of individuals in the West have spoken out about this. So that's given me a unique position to be in touch with people of the Muslim world who want resources and support. And a lot of the spirituality of my clients who are Muslim is very sincere and authentic. Now, I'm not claiming it is equal to our Christian faith. I'm not, espousing relativism, but I try to support them being the best version of a Muslim person that they can be, and look at the things that are hindering their own emotional life and spiritual life from trying to live their authentic self as a married man. And by the way, Jim, some of them are married with children that I know, and a lot of Christian friends of mine and Catholic friends of mine who struggle with same-sex erotic issues. I want to tell you, I want to be the voice that propels this message. They have experienced change. It's different for each person, but I have friends who never thought marriage would be possible and are happily married with children. So I think that is a hopeful message that I want to at least have a chance to throw in there at the end of our conversation, that for some people, significant change is possible. And for others, peace is possible. Acceptance of yourself as you are, accepting God's love for you as you are, and finding ways to live more in line with your conscience is possible, to where you can reduce unwanted behaviors and find support from friends and family to do so.
That's so important. In recent weeks, we've had two cardinals in the Catholic Church. One is Cardinal Marx, and the other is Cardinal with a French name, argue that the catechism is just wrong on this. Now, I've only seen news reports. I haven't read any of their work on this, but I rather suspect that they haven't done any work on it. I rather suspect this in part because the arguments that were attributed to them in the Catholic press could best be described as witless, which is a sort of a semi-polite word for clueless. And the message that you have is extremely important and needs to be brought into the public debate in a very clear way. Well, we've come to an end, and enough of our debate and interventions. We have today's gospel from John. Jesus said to those Jews who believed in him, "If you remain in my word, you will truly be my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How can you say you will become free?" Jesus answered them, "Amen, amen, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave of sin. A slave does not remain in the household forever, but a son always remains. So if the Son frees you, then you will truly be free. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, but you are trying to kill me because my word has no room among you. I tell you what I have seen in the Father's presence, then do what you have heard from the Father." They answered and said to him, "Our father is Abraham." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works of Abraham. But now you are trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You are doing the works of your father." So they said to him, "We're not born of fornication. We have one Father, God." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Come, Lord Jesus, come."
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent.
Mario has to get back to the galleys. I mean, the classroom.
I'm really honored that you guys would have me on too. I'm not a philosopher like both of you, and I appreciate your openness to conversation, and thank you for your wisdom and your good questions, difficult but good questions.
All right. Well,
No, it was good. Excellent.
good. Godspeed to you.
Godspeed.
Thank you,
Take
guys.
care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.